Hi, welcome to what we are calling Classic Bookmark. When we started shooting these interviews in the spring of 1988, we had no idea the show would go on for 30 years, with over 400 episodes. To celebrate and mark this achievement, we have selected 15 shows. Choosing was difficult. Most of the writers chosen, like Horton Foote and Ray Bradbury, are deceased. Others, like Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, are perfectly well, but I do not think we will be lucky enough to have them on the show again. We purposely did not include some bookmark favorites like Rick Bragg, Winston Groom, Sina Jeter-Naslund, Brad Watson, Daniel Wallace, Michelle Richmond, and others, since we plan to visit with them regularly in the future. Viewers will notice that the technology has improved considerably in 30 years. We've cleaned these up the best we could. These first 30 years have been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy watching these as much as I did making them. Horton Foote has 2 Oscars, a Pulitzer, and an Emmy. Born and raised in Texas, his home state is often the setting for his plays and screenplays. Still a prolific writer in his 80s, Foote recently was at the Alabama Shakespeare Festival in Montgomery, where Vernon Early, one of his plays, was staged. Most Alabamians will know him for his beautiful screen adaptation of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird.
I think it's probably the humanity in the book. And that's something it's very difficult to assess, really. It's a quality that I don't know that one can manufacture.
Mm-hmm.
I think it probably comes from Harper and her great compassion and love for people and understanding of people. Certainly, her father must have been a remarkable man. We all know Atticus was her father. And I think that everybody that worked on the screen version had that sense of responsibility to try to capture that sense of humanity and compassion. We've just had a 35th anniversary celebration of the screenplay, of the film, in Los Angeles. And everybody that's alive arrived except for Harper, and you know she's very shy. She doesn't take part in these things.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, you know. I saw it for the first time in a long time on a big screen, and people were there who had never seen it, young people, older people, and they were just as taken with it as when it was first shown.
It doesn't date.
No.
Although
really.
it's wonderfully localized, the time and the place are
the specifics
very specific, but it seems not to have ever gotten old.
No, it doesn't. And it was a real passion for 2 young people, a young producer and young director, Alan Pakula and Bob Mulligan. They really treated it with such respect, and not in a pretentious way, but you've always felt their love for the project and their nurturing it, and that's still there somehow, permeating it.
Well, you've done stage plays and original screenplays and adaptations. When you do an adaptation of someone else's work, and it's almost always, I think, been a piece of fiction, what are the special problems and opportunities and constraints that you operate under when you're trying to work with somebody else's stuff?
Well, the first constraint is that you feel a terrible responsibility. I only do things that I feel some kinship with. And the second difficulty is it's agonizing to try to get into someone else's psyche and to try to catch the essence of the work, and yet knowing that you can't be just literal about it, you have to has to be a point where you say, well, to hell with it. It's really, I've got to do this job now and for another medium, and I've got to cut out this over-responsible feeling and put my sleeves up and get to work. But still in all, you're trying to get inside of someone else's ego and ideas. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've often enjoyed it, and with Mockingbird, it was almost like, well, actually, I came from the same kind of town as, you know, as Harper's, and it hadn't won the Pulitzer Prize when I started working on it, and she was so kind of laid back about it and so modest about it, said she didn't want to even talk about it or see about it, just go ahead and write it. And she's been so generous always afterwards. And I had a wonderful experience with Faulkner, who I never met, but I did 2 of his works. And the first one was The Old Man, which I did first 35 years ago, and then we repeated it last year, another version of it. And but then after that, I did Tomorrow, which is done as a play, and it was on Playhouse 90, and then as a film. And in that, I invented much more than I ever do, because it's based on a short story of Faulkner's in which there's about a paragraph about a dark-complected woman who has this child. Well, she fascinated me, so the first half of my screenplay is about this woman. And I was in terror. I didn't know how he would take it. But he sent a message back that he was pleased and allowed me to share the dramatic copyright with him, so that you can't ever do it without, as a play, without my permission and his permission, which was most generous.
But he understood, because he had been in Hollywood off and on for 12 years. He had adapted other people's novels. He had
That's
adapted
right.
a novel by Ernest Hemingway even into a
Yes,
very
he did.
successful movie. So he knew what you were up to. And where I want to go with this is an awful lot of novelists complain bitterly about what happens
Well, they should.
to their books on the screen.
Because I had a reverse experience with The Chase. And it had nothing to do, finally, with my work.
You know, and one novelist.
It's a terrible, you know, it's a real problem. But, and I'm not faulting anyone, but I think that really, if you're not deeply in sympathy with the work, I think it is almost impossible to do a job.
Do you suppose, I mean, would you give this out as a piece of advice, for example, that novelists ought to think much more seriously about adapting their own novels for the screen?
Well, I
If they
don't
want
know.
it done right, so to
It's
speak?
such a different technique. I couldn't give that advice, because I think sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't work at all. I think so often they try and the medium is so different. Because actually, essentially, there are some things in common, because a novel is often very visual, much more than a play is.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, screen is a visual medium. I think you have to be careful that so many people, particularly adapting plays, think, oh, well, I'm going to have all this freedom now, I can go here and go there. And they turn them into travelogues, you know. You get so lost in all the transitions and the scenes that you miss the heart of it, of the work. So it's, and then, you know, then you have, in the old system, which is still much in operation, you have all these people that want to get into the act and fix what the writer's done and add to it and subtract and make it better according to their feeling.
Right. There is a certain restraint that's called for. Just because you can take the camera anywhere doesn't mean that you should take
I think
it
you have to be
everywhere.
very careful. Yeah.
You were very well served with a trip to Bountiful. Of course, you had hands-on. You were involved with that. But that is apartment, bus station, bus, bus station
But
and,
it's
and the
interesting
house.
about Bountiful because it was first done in the theater.
Right,
And we couldn't take the bus ride, you see.
right.
So in the film we could. And it was pleasant to do that.
It opens it up.
Well, yes, but I think it serves it well.
Hmm.
It doesn't distract and it doesn't take away from the essential drive of the piece.
Well, actually, the scenes on the bus are some of the most memorable scenes.
Yeah.
Just the two.
Well, we had that. We could have
Right.
that in the theater.
Right.
But we couldn't take, being on the road and going place to place and all of that.
Right. Well, over the years, you've been working on I don't know if the cycle is completed or if it's still...
Yes, it's done.
Is it? It's a cycle of 9?
9 plays.
All Texas, their home place plays for you.
Mm-hmm.
East Texas, Galveston, Houston.
Mm-hmm.
Very few playwrights attempt plays that move along in cycles. And
Yeah.
thinking about it, we think of O'Neill's attempted cycle, of which we only have a couple. There may have been more, but we don't
He
have
burned
them.
them.
But playwrights don't normally do that. Why did you want to do that? And what do you think the advantages of doing it are?
Well, excuse me. I wrote the first many years ago, and it was done on television with a wonderful cast: Julie Harris and Mildred Dunnett and Fritz Weaver and E.G. Marshall and the kind of people you could get in those days. And there was a very great critic who was a friend of mine named Stark Young, who loved the work, and he felt I should do something more with it. And I had enormous respect for him, so I probably put the seed in my head.
Uh-huh.
And then he passed away, and time passed, and 10 years passed, really. And my mother and father passed away, and I went home and began to do the things one does, to get the house in order. And I don't know, I just began to think of what Stark had said, and I began to think about their life and the life in that little town that I'd known or that I'd heard about, because a lot of it takes place before I was born. And I went back. I was living in New Hampshire in the woods then, and I just went back, and it was a lonely winter, and I just began to work. And I had no idea how many there would be. As a matter of fact, I stopped at 8, and then a friend of mine read them and said there should be one more. And,
Friends of yours are constantly coming up with wonderful ideas for things for you to do.
and I had no idea I could do another, but then I began to think of something else.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it was done. And and was a time of great meaning for me, because not only did I get in touch with the past that I'd heard about, and my imagination came into play. I mean, it's nothing literal about these plays,
Right.
although they're loosely based on my mother and father. And then we began to do them as films, and we've done 5 now. And then a lot of them have been done in the theater. It's almost impossible to do them in one evening, though many people are trying.
Well, along a different line, people are willing to spend $24.95 and buy a big new hardcover popular novel. It weighs 7 pounds, it's 700 pages long, and they actually read it.
Do you think they actually read it?
I think they do read the
Yeah.
Stephen Kings and the John Grishams and
Yeah,
the
maybe
Tom
so.
Clancy's
Maybe so.
and
Yeah.
Danielle Steele and Jacqueline Suzanne and so on.
Mm-hmm.
They will read certain things. But my observation is that people do not buy and read plays very much.
Well, I'm sure you're right.
I'm sure you know. Why do you suppose it is that people don't pick up a play and read it and get the pleasure that is there for them?
Well, I think they're intimidated by the form. I think they think that it's. I guess of course, I'm so used to reading plays. I can't conceive of anyone being intimidated by them. But I think that they don't know how to project into the form, and I guess it requires certain imaginative feats to kind of imagine, because a good playwright really doesn't describe a great deal. I mean, except through dialogue. I mean, Shakespeare never describes a room or a battlefield or anything, and Chekhov rarely does. But to me, it's a very rewarding thing to read. So I really can't analyze it. I really have no idea.
It takes a certain amount of energy, imaginative energy, I guess, to read a play, because you have to sort of
you have to supply certain
supply
things.
it.
Yeah. And yet, and I think that certain plays really don't read well, and certain playwrights have almost a tin ear, but it's amazing that in spite of that, if they're a certain kind of craftsman, their plays will come alive on stage with actors. So I guess this is true of all forms of literature. You know, I think that certain novels are successful in spite of the technique or the lack of technique. What makes a good novelist? What makes a good playwright? It's very hard to define, because even an inferior novel sometimes can have an impact, almost a subjective impact.
Well, the awful novel of all time that is, I think, American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser.
Style-wise.
There's not one graceful sentence in that entire book.
Not, but it has an impact.
It has its own power.
Yeah.
There is a cliche that people often use about novels and film, and that is that a first-rate novel often makes a second-rate film, and a second-rate novel may very well make a first-rate film. And when they do this, they're thinking about things like The Sound and the Fury and The Great Gatsby that don't seem to make the transition very well. How would you respond to something as simple as that?
The Great Gatsby, I don't know as well as I know The Sound and the Fury. I think The Sound and the Fury was a mockery. I mean, they didn't even try to approach the work in any intelligent way. And Gatsby, I just felt, was terribly overproduced, and the essence of that novel is a kind of a direct simplicity, you know, and it almost catches you up without knowing it. You know, it doesn't go out and try to grab you. It has its own way of enveloping you. And you know, I just think that film, when it has a lot of money at stake, people get nervous and they rely on what I call film cliches to solve problems. And it's so easy to say, well, this will make it better if you'd make him a Cajun rather than this, and blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't work. And there's no reason why that, particularly the Faulkner novel, couldn't work very well.
You have children who are acting.
Yeah.
You have children who are professional actors. Two. One boy, one girl.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Do you ever write, and they've been in your plays,
yes.
I know, several times.
Yes.
Do you write parts for them?
No. No.
Do they audition?
I don't even write, people think I write parts for Robert Duvall, who's very close to me, and I don't write parts for him either. I'm always glad when there's a part appears that, you know, he wants to do, but I don't do that.
Well, Tender Mercies was a great hit for both of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you didn't have him in mind when you wrote it.
No.
Do you ever write a screenplay or a stage play thinking that when this thing goes into production, there's, even if you're not writing it for Robert Duvall or for your son or your daughter, do you ever have an actor or an actor?
Well, there's a point that you finally begin to say, well, I'm almost through with this now. What am I going to do with it? Who can bring this, give it life? And certainly in Tender Mercies, it didn't take me long to figure out it was Bob. I didn't know that he could sing. I didn't know that he wrote country music. And I did a terrible thing to him because I wasn't living in New York. I was living in New York, but only partly, as I am now. But my daughter was friends with Bob, and she knew that he could sing, and she told me. So I asked if he and his girlfriend could come down and talk with me. I had written a screenplay that I wanted him to tell him about. And he came down, and poor thing, I read the screenplay to him. I've never done that before. Oh. And he's such a gentleman. I'm sure he could have died, because if he hadn't liked it, it would have been terrible.
Yes.
But he did like it. And then I said, I understand you can sing, and as you do sing. And he said yes. And so he and the gal, his girlfriend, sang "Wings of a Dove" for me. And I hadn't really thought of what song I was going to put in there. And so I thought, well, I'll just use this. Right. So he gave me a great gift, which often happens, in the theater, because it's really films. It's a collaborative medium, and a writer is foolish if he doesn't take advantage of that. Mm-hmm.
Moving from the sublime to the ridiculous, and I'd be wrong not to ask you this. Everybody has a screenplay they've written. In America, there's where there used to be a novel in someone's desk drawer that's unpublished. Now, all over America, especially in California, I'm certain, there are thousands and thousands of screenplays. And all the people who have written these screenplays want to know the answer to this question.
How do I get an agent?
How do you get your screenplay somewhere? How do you get it to someone? What do people do? What should they do?
If I knew that, and I could patent it, I'd be the richest man in America. It's heartbreaking. I don't know. My other daughter is a playwright and a screenwriter, and it's amazing. I'd watch her journey. I don't like to use the word luck, but it whatever it is, whatever defines luck or whatever. I know that, for instance, I didn't have any idea. I started out as an actor. And Agnes DeMille and I were in a company together, and we were doing improvisations, and I was doing them about Texas. And she said, I think you have some material. You should ever think about writing? I said, no. But I thought about it, and as an actor, I thought, well, I'll write a one-act play which I can play the lead for. So I did. And the company which we were with put it on. Now, Robert Coleman of the Daily Mirror, for some reason, decided to come down and see it. And he praised it and praised myself as an actor and praised the play. And so I thought, well, this is how I'm going to establish myself as an actor. I'm going to write plays. So I had some money and went back to Texas, and I wrote a play, a full-length play. And then that time, New York is really a provincial town in many ways, and it, things get around, and I guess it got around. I had some talent as a playwright. And so Brooks Atkinson, who was the dean then, came down to see this. Well, he praised the play very highly and didn't like me so much as an actor, which made me furious. And I said, I'll show him I'm never going to write again. But I acted a lot that summer and got out of my system and stuff. But if those two things hadn't happened, I don't know, and I know writers who are gifted beyond words. It just cannot seem to get in the front door. And the same thing happened, with me. I mean, Mockingbird was my second film. I had no experience really as a film writer.
Do you have to live in Southern California to
No,
get into the business?
I've never lived there. I refuse to live there. I go out for conferences, but Mockingbird was written in my house in New York. Mm-hmm. No, that's not the problem. As a matter of fact, I think it's better if they don't, because out there you get into this whole business of formulas and what makes this and that, which is a lot of nonsense.
But people feel if they're not there, that they don't stand a chance of getting into the business. They can't have lunch. They can't have the meeting.
And then they go for this business of pitching, which I think is obscene. And I don't get me started on the Hollywood system and writers.
On the contrary, I'd love to get you started on it.
Well, I just think that young writers the most essential thing is to find who they are and not let a bunch of other people say, this is what you do, this is the formula, this is how. Find out who they are, what they really want to write about. And then, it's terrible. It's a lonely business, writing, but it's also a wonderful, wonderful way of living. And commercial success is the least of it. It's if you feel fulfilled, if you feel you have something that interests you and that you're compelled to do, which I really think that's the thing. I think if writers are going out to say, well, now let me watch this show to figure out how they do it on this show or that show. And so many of our writers, now have their reference is television. Even films, I feel, are so influenced by writers who have been raised on television. Mm-hmm. And there's lack of humanity. And the best place, that's why I say stay out of Hollywood, stay out of New York, really. And nurture your own little garden, your own little patch, and find out who you are, why you're different than. That's the important thing. It's not that, how Ernest Hemingway did it, or how Faulkner did it, or how Catherine Ann Porter. I mean, you learn from all these people, and certainly from Catherine Ann, I owe an enormous debt. But you finally have to say, who am I? And there's no one way to get to heaven. Everybody has to take their own journey and find their own way.
Next week, we'll talk with two writers who grew up in Birmingham, one a poet, one a writer of prose, Andrew Glaze and Deborah McDowell.